So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure to have you here. We gathered today to have an expert talk on negative effects of corruption on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and the impact of the pandemic on developing economies. This event will primarily focus on how corruption adversely affects the achievement of SDGs at the level of resource mobilization and goal-specific actions. We hope to look into the impact of the pandemic on economic conditions of different countries. In particular, we also hope to focus on such adverse effects of corruption as rising poverty, hunger, economic and gender inequality, climate change-related disasters, the overall impact of the lives on the lives of people worldwide, and hopefully the way forward. This is the first such event in IACA after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic around 3 years ago, and we are particularly honored that Professor Jeffery Sachs agreed to be the pioneer after the pandemic and restart, hopefully, the IACA's activities in this realm. We hope to launch various other expert talks, seminars, and other similar events in the future, and we very much hope that we will be able to host you again at our premises. This event is conducted in the hybrid format, which means that in addition to all the people gathered in this room, we'll have a large number of participants online. Of course, there is no need to introduce Professor Sachs. We all know him very well. Just to say a couple of words, he's a renowned world-renowned economics professor. He's the bestselling author, innovative educator, and a global leader in sustainable development. Last but not least, Professor Sachs is the SDG Advocate, which is very pertinent in the context of our event today. And he cooperates in this realm with, among others, with the UN Secretary-General António Guterres. The event will be moderated by Director of IACA's academic programs, Mr. Pawan Kumar Sinha. And I don't know whether Dean already solved the problems with his microphone. If yes, may I invite you, Dean, to address the gathering.
Would you like to address gathering, Dean, or?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, you're on mute?
It's muted, yeah.
There.
No. Well, what I suggest then is if those technical difficulties are solved, that we can return to the meeting. So maybe we could then start with the meeting.
Okay.
I'm all yours.
Okay. So again, I welcome you.
Thank you.
It's our honor that you came here, and I still remember a few days ago we discussed a lot of things. It's very important that we are going to talk on SDGs and anti-corruption. Before that, let me announce that this session will be recorded. Whoever is online, they are being informed. And we may use these clips for any future purposes, promotion purposes. Little bit on the format. It will be more on a question-answer basis, in the sense I have some questions which we think is very pertinent in relation to SDGs and corruption. And at the end, we will have some quick Q&A depending upon the time left, because Jeffrey has to return early. There's another appointment. So, but we still have time till 1:30. So a lot of things what we can discuss. Just to inform you, Jeffrey, that we have our guests here. We have our IACA staff in the room, a small gathering, but more than 200 people are registered. 100 our students they are online, and mainly our master students and alumni. So they will all be listening to you. And just to tell that one of our other master's program has a course coming up, SDGs and anti-corruption.
Excellent.
So maybe they will gather a lot of information because they have to make certain presentations. So let me start by first indicating that very recently, under your supervision, SDG report has come 2022, and it has given a lot of information what's going on, and a lot of, I would say, not very encouraging part of it. So as an economist, you have been engaged in development of these goals. As an economist, how do you see when the world is developing and a lot of technological advancements are happening on the one side, which has positive effects on whether it is agriculture, whether it is any kind of infrastructure, education, but on the other side, there's also a rapid rise of cyber crimes, hunger, poverty is going down. How do you see this? So many things which are happening all around. What is your view on this?
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the chance, first of all, to be here, and also greetings to students online. I think the right starting point is that the Sustainable Development Goals form a public policy agenda. They're not things that will happen by themselves. They are very much a government led effort. And this is important because lots of things come from the market economy. Lots of good things can come from the market economy. But the Sustainable Development Goals, to a very significant extent, are a public sector agenda. And even when the private sector has a huge role to play, like investing in clean energy, for example, the public sector is vital to set the right standards, to set the right mechanisms, to create the market incentives, and so on. So almost everything that we are talking about with Sustainable Development Goals requires effective government. That's a challenge. That's why IACA's agenda is so essential, because in the most general sense, corruption means being broken. It means that government is not functioning. There are a number of types of corruption, a number of ways that the system can be broken, a number of mechanisms that can go wrong. But it is generally the case that achieving sustainable development requires effective governance. And that means governments that are functioning, both adopting goals, indeed the goals that the world has adopted, and being able to implement policies to achieve those goals. As a general matter, since the SDGs cover a lot of ground, agriculture, healthcare, education, gender equality, safe water, clean electricity, digital infrastructure, climate transformation, and so forth. This would not be an easy agenda, period. So the SDGs refer to government programs or policies that generally have a time horizon of 20 years or more. They generally require rather deep transformations of society, even moving from a situation where half the kids complete high school to a situation where all children complete high school is a big job. even a big job for just normal government. Making a transformation from fossil fuel-based energy to green energy is an enormous, complex challenge. You have to retool everything, rewire everything, different kinds of vehicles, different kinds of power system, different kinds of market structures. So the SDGs would be hard, period, for any government. They're hard because they're complex, they are transformative, they are multidimensional, and they have a time horizon of 20 years or more. Any one of those would defeat a typical government. And so, in general, the SDGs are not being achieved. And the main reason they're not being achieved is governance at some level, whether it's international cooperation is lacking, national governments find the agenda overwhelming or can't pay for it, local governments don't have the resources to carry out the local investments. All of these are real reasons. Things were not on track from the start because the UN is a lot better at setting goals than it is at achieving them. And by UN, I mean the collection of member states. So they adopted goals, and it's nice, and I worked myself for 3 years to help them negotiate these 17 sustainable development goals, but there was no plan afterwards, and even basics of these goals, like how to pay for them, whether tax revenues or borrowing or other development aid, was never clearly stated, and until today, not clearly articulated. Then to come to the current situation, I would say by 2019, you could say, God, it would really be nice if someone was paying attention to these goals, because we only have 15 years and 2030 will be around the corner. But then came the pandemic, and the pandemic was a massive shock to the whole global society. And it remains till today something very deeply disruptive, and it broke links between government and society. Most governments were also not really capable of handling a shock of this magnitude, did not do a wonderful job. The international community did not act as a community in important ways. Then came the war in Ukraine and the sanctions regime, and almost the entire focus of the Western countries on the war to the basic exclusion of any other issue. So there is no attention span in Brussels or Washington or Tokyo or elsewhere for anything other than the war, and relatedly, the geopolitical competition between the US and China, which is also center stage. So the truth is, in 2023, we're hanging on by our fingernails right now. The SDGs will not be achieved by 2030. And we have a big international crisis in general. And you could see in the G20 meetings, which I participate in quite a bit. Last year, the foreign ministers would not talk to each other across the geopolitical divide. This year, there was a 5-minute unpleasant meeting, which is a huge improvement, because I'm for all meetings, unpleasant or pleasant, as the basis for saving ourselves. But in general, the attention span is extremely weak. Then comes IACA's agenda. And so I'll just put that into context. We need good governance, not just governance. We need good governance. In fact, we need exceptionally good governance. And I am not an expert in your agenda, but I am a practitioner of public policy for 40 years, so I see many ways that corruption derails good governance. It's not the only way. And I should just mention once again, just complexity derails governance because most governments are not designed for highly complex tasks. Most governments at best are designed to carry out particular pieces of public management. And if it's too complicated, it's very, very hard for governments. Governments are not think tanks. They're not creative organizations by and large. They are not designing new things. They are trying to implement basic programs, whether it's the school system, the healthcare system, and so forth. And this agenda is, in any event, difficult. So maybe I'll just say a few words about what I know, and then we go on to the next topics. For me, one of the themes that I've tried to emphasize in my 40 years of work as a development practitioner is the need for a differential diagnosis. I learned it from my wife, who's a clinician. She's a pediatrician. And I learned in awe when she'd get a call in the middle of the night from the mother of an infant, and the infant had a fever. My wife would go through a long checklist on the phone in a very systematic way, starting with the thing that was most dangerous is the neck stiff because maybe it's meningitis. I'll meet you in the emergency room. But if it's not that, then we can go down the list. And she would form a differential diagnosis. And you have to go to the emergency room. Should you take 2 aspirin? Go to sleep, everything's fine, or whatever it is. And you have to be right because lives depend on it. So I was in awe of that differential diagnosis because a fever can come from 1,000 causes. And the first job of a doctor is to identify in a hierarchy, emergency or not, what are the possibilities, what kind of tests to run, what are the practical procedures. So that applies to corruption also, which is that corruption comes in many forms and has many different types, and doing a differential diagnosis for me would be quite important to understand what are the barriers to good governance and to what extent do they fall under the rubric of corruption, under the rubric of incompetence, under the rubric of a problem we've never seen before, help, and so forth. So to do the differential diagnosis to understand which of these things is happening. And then for me, as a rank amateur, but talking to practitioners and professionals, on the corruption side, I see many kinds of corruption that have different implications for this agenda. In the United States, we have a very corrupt political system, but it's quite interesting. It's all legalized corruption, or not all, but mostly. It's campaign finance. So there's large financing, and the government is basically owned and operated by the large campaign donors, and they determine the agenda of the US government to a large extent. It's very efficient, by the way. Wall Street has bought the financial system. Big healthcare has bought the healthcare system. Big oil has bought the energy system. The military industrial complex has bought foreign policy. And each of them has their donor community, which pays for this. Now, this isn't called corruption in the United States, but I guarantee it's corruption because it is basically the purchase of public policy by private means on a large scale. Then there's the more conventional political corruption where all of that happens, but it's against the law. The US genius is they made it all legal. So they made it a disaster by law, by the erroneous idea that corporate donations are free speech. They're not free speech, they're corruption. But it's called free speech in the United States, corporate free speech. But in other countries, it's campaign donations that are illicit in return for policies or kickbacks and so forth. So there's a whole political stream of corruption that is very important. That's one category for me that I would try to identify. A second category is multinational company related corruption, which is typically huge in poorer countries, especially around the natural resource sector. You just cannot touch a mining sector without corruption everywhere. There's a lot of money at stake. It's very easy to give a concession. It's very easy to twist a bid. It's very easy to, and I'm watching this in a number of countries where countries that desperately need foreign exchange reserves and desperately need revenue don't get revenue from their mining sector because it's already owned by Swiss companies, by Cayman Islands companies, by Chinese companies, you name it. It's been privatized, spontaneously so-called, through corrupt practices. So that kind of corruption is very interesting because it's powerful first world companies operating in very low income settings. So it's a recipe for corruption. Generally, the rich country governments know about it, sometimes support it, sometimes turn a blind eye, don't care very much. And so it's a complicit kind of corruption of the powerful and the weak. The weak get blamed for all the corruption. Look at how corrupt the government is, but the bribe is coming from the rich companies. So I see a lot of that. And I'm even sometimes pulled aside by, it hasn't happened recently because they don't talk to me very much, but a US ambassador would pull me aside and tell your friends how important company X is. And don't let them do, and these are of corrupt US companies. So it's also part of the process. So this is a second piece of the differential diagnosis. What is the ecosystem of the corruption? To what extent is it powerful actors from outside? Are they backed by their national governments, which make them even more powerful? And what's happening on the inside? Is it for the family of the head of state? Is it for a group? Is it for a political party? What is the nature of that? But the multinational side is really painful because a lot of poor countries depend on natural resource royalties for financing public programs, and they get very, very little. And this is a major part of the shortcomings of governance right now. I'm working in the, I'm not effectively working, but I'm trying to help the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is a country that has lots of minerals. They collect almost no tax revenues from the minerals because the corruption is pervasive. The concessions were given away. The taxes that are on the books are not collected. The levels of corruption are widespread. The neighbors are engaged. Oh my God. It's a nightmare of a place that desperately needs revenues, even for the most basic, the most basic kinds of activities. Well, I could go on and on, but I think getting the template of what's going on and understanding it, and which variant is at stake is a big part of our challenge. And then where I'm even less, I mean, I'm not an expert in any of this except impressionistically, is the kinds of remedies that could potentially be used. And one of the factors in this is that there has to be honesty about the nature of the corruption on all sides. And somehow there isn't, because basically the low-income countries always take the blame, and the powerful interests that often are agents of this corruption almost never take the blame, or if they do, it's a passing phenomenon. But many of our major companies in the United States have been agents of corruption in quite public ways. And recently, last month, Glencore, one of my least favorite companies, major mining company, Swiss-based, was paid several $billion in the US courts for corruption that it committed in the DRC. I don't even understand that, actually. If the US reverted the money, I would begin to understand this, but I don't think that there's any process of reverting the money. So this is something also that IACA may want to take up, which is how the international law could actually support the restitution and the financing of ill-gotten gains. So let me pause there.
Thank you so much. Indeed, these are the areas which are not only areas of research, but I think a lot of states who have to come together and come to some kind of agreement. And indeed, we have United Nations Convention Against Corruption, where all the state parties come together, like the COP, for example, for climate. I mean, that is the platform. And again, when it comes to international cooperation, there are so many interests, perhaps, which are counteracting each other, and so it's a process is very slow as usual. We often call anti-corruption also as a generational issue, just like SDGs. Mm-hmm. We cannot think of anti-corruption within a short period of time. But let me come back to SDGs first, and then I have more questions on corruption. Maybe you have some views on this. Is sustainable development concept came well in the previous century, actually, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then we had started the Millennium Goal. Two questions. One is, because you have witnessed both SDGs and MDGs, so how these were developed and how they are different, number one. And number two, a broad question, is it a good idea to have so many goals and achieve very less, or it is next, maybe not SDG, whatever new name, less goal but more achievable goals? What are your responses to these two questions?
So the concept of sustainable development came to the global forefront with the commission of Dr. Brundtland in 1987. She was Prime Minister of Norway, and she led an important commission that defined sustainable development as meeting the needs of the current generation in a way that enables future generations to meet their needs. And this was 15 years after the Stockholm Summit and 5 years before the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. And in Rio, sustainable development was adopted as the formal framework for global diplomacy around environment and economy, and Agenda 21 was adopted. And sustainable development became something of a core idea of global diplomacy. In 2002, at a personal level, I moved from Harvard to Columbia University, and I said that I wanted my new title to be Professor of Sustainable Development. And they said, "What's that?" Because they had never really heard of that. And I explained a little bit, and I became the first Professor of Sustainable Development at Columbia University. And subsequently, we made a PhD program and a master's program, several master's programs, and an undergraduate major in sustainable development, and later came the Sustainable Development Goals. By the Sustainable Development Goal period, the definition had changed in a useful way, which was, instead of emphasizing overwhelmingly the intergenerational aspects, which are still real, it's now more the triple bottom line: economic, social, and environmental objectives. And I view that as a more helpful summary, which is economic development, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability as the package deal of what sustainable development means. And it's a tricky agenda because it's saying three difficult things to accomplish. One is economic development, which is difficult enough, period. Second, do it so no group is left behind. Oh, who cares about that? Many people say. Third, and do it in an environmentally sustainable way. Are you kidding? You know, in other words, it's a cascade of difficulties. So it's a hard agenda. I don't see a way around the agenda given our global reality. Could you really have economic development without environmental sustainability when we're about to reach 1.5 degrees and it's going to hit the whole world in a massive, massive crisis, starting with poor people in developing countries? I can't see it. So I can't really see how to separate these, in fact. But we don't have the tools to accomplish these issues. So I was just with IACA around the block and was saying just an hour ago that we need tools that help governments on this complicated agenda, because governments do not know how to do this. And 17 goals, 169 targets, it's my job. I could not name 169 targets even remotely. 17 goals I can name, but 169 targets, forget it. So it needs to be repackaged in a way which is manageable. And it especially needs, we need to open up the SDG app and plug in your country data and get out your differential diagnosis or your pathway. And we're not quite there yet, but that's literally what we need, is tools that quantify, clarify, prioritize, and maybe ChatGPT will do it. Maybe we will combine a chat box with a really great dynamic optimizing program and be able to spit out SDG programming. Why not? This is what we need actually to do to help create the tools for this. So I don't want to oversimplify our current crisis, because it is a poly-crisis. It is truly an environmental crisis. It is truly a social crisis. It is truly an economic crisis. It's true. But then you're really talking about a very difficult situation to address properly, even in the best of governance, because it's beyond government capacity. And because of corruption and other factors, it's even beyond government interest. And that's the fact. But we can't wish away the problem saying, oh, those are too hard, we'll take an easy one. So I don't actually want to revert to, well, we'll just focus on poverty. You cannot focus on poverty without focusing on climate change. It's not even possible to think in those terms. So we really need to up our game. And that's why my biggest frustration is that the governments that really have at least financial capacity and some technical capacity, like my own, should stop fighting wars and start aiming at sustainable development because they're wasting our time and they're making the world a very dangerous place. And Europe has lost its way this past year because of the Ukraine war, completely turning everything into a question of this war, forgetting all the lessons of diplomacy to end wars, because now our diplomats are the biggest promoters of arms escalation, which is absurd and tragic, and because we're forgetting all the rest of this agenda. So I am sticking with the Sustainable Development Goals, period. But I really think we need better tools to help policymakers understand what this is about. And we should not pretend that our politicians are polymaths, are dynamic optimizers, are sustainable development experts. They're not, they're politicians. They like giving speeches, they like shaking hands, they like winning office, they like holding power. They're not experts on almost any of this. And our governments are also not really very expert. Who trained 20 years ago on the energy transition, for heaven's sake? Nobody. Almost nobody knows anything about this. They're learning a little bit, but that's where we really need to help governance, is to explain this is the agenda. Here are practical things that can be done. This is what a plan looks like. This is how you could implement it. This is how you can audit it. This is how you can follow through. We need strong planning agencies. We need ministries of planning that can really do this kind of work. And this, I think, is where we, from the more academic or analytical side, can contribute.
Okay, thank you so much. So next question is all about, again, you have rightly pointed out that one goal cannot be segregated from the goal, and we were doing some kind of research, especially linked to corruption, and the goals like hunger or poverty or climate change, everybody, there's interlinkages. So you have rightly pointed out that we need to have a very holistic view. How much you think is a need for, you just mentioned about politicians. So getting tools is fine, but then there should be an intent to get tools, or what we always call political will to do things. So when you are interacting with so many people around the world, what pulse do you get from those people? I mean, of course, at the statement level, they'll say we are interested in SDGs, we are interested in reducing corruption, but do you feel there is something missing?
Again, I would make a kind of differential diagnosis and look at different circumstances. In the United States, my country, there's no limit on financial or technical capacity to accomplish sustainable development objectives. And when COVID hit, the United States was able to mobilize $7 trillion in 3 years of emergency response, and to do it at almost zero interest rates. In other words, to borrow massively at very low interest rates, because it's a big country, $23 trillion of annual output, $70,000 per person of income. There's no limit to what you can do with that. So the problems in the United States are that our society is divided, our government is very corrupted, the political system has been hacked, in my view, which is that, and by that I mean that if you have a political structure long enough, rich and powerful people will figure out how to take it over. And that's what happened in the United States over the last 40 years. That's one kind of problem. Another kind of problem is Ghana or Malawi or Chad or Togo at the other end of the income level. And I speak to finance ministers of these countries pretty much daily. And they say, Jeff, it's fine, except we're broke, we're in default, and our budget can't even support kids in primary school, much less high school. So that's a different kind of problem. And it requires a different kind of solution and action. So it's a big challenge of what to do and how to do it. My main approach personally in terms of theory of change is to show that the goals that we set are achievable and how they can be achieved, and then yell at politicians for not achieving them. But telling them, what is your role? What aren't you doing? What could you be doing? It doesn't work very effectively. I just don't have another way to do it. But I believe that the constructive approach of showing what can be done is part of this story. But I'll give one example that I spoke about again an hour ago, so I apologize to Albert for having to hear it again. But just an example for me that was a very pertinent lesson, very relevant for IACA. And that is with the MDGs, I was advisor to Kofi Annan. And at the time, the AIDS pandemic was running completely without any control. And in particular, the shocking thing for me was that the new cocktails of antiretrovirals had been developed in the US in the mid-1990s, but none of that approach was reaching Africa, which was the epicenter of the pandemic. So in 2000, I argued that if you looked not at the sales price of these medicines, but at their production cost, which was a few $100s per year of drug regimen for the antiretrovirals, that could be made available to poor people to stay alive, and that was a good moral and practical return, and that all we needed was a few $1 billion a year of funding to do that. And so I recommended a global fund, which became the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. And at the time, the charge was that it was very naive because everything will be corrupted quickly, that you could not get drugs to poor people reliably. There would be a black market. Poor people wouldn't know how to take the drugs after all. Bed nets, which was my favorite idea for malaria. I wanted to give away 1 billion bed nets, which eventually happened. They'll be stolen, they'll be turned into wedding veils, there'll be every possible thing you can imagine will go wrong. The Global Fund was set up, surprisingly, very interesting story, but anyway, it was set up and money was put into it. And lo and behold, even the weakest governments came up with programs that were effective in getting Global Fund money into the mouths of people as antiretroviral medicines. Millions of people suddenly staying alive because of the program, even in terribly poor countries. So what did I learn from that? Several things. First, it worked in part because the health services were a professional niche within a broad political system. And they were relatively professionalized, not perfectly, but there were medical doctors, there were registered nurses, And those people had trained, and they actually wanted to keep people alive. And the people who were dying wanted to stay alive. So they expected the net or the medicine to come. And so the system actually functioned even in places that we were told had no system at all. It didn't mean these countries were functioning properly, but it meant you could get money from Geneva into the mouths of people daily for 3 drugs, for a cocktail, to keep them alive. Amazing. And we had known that, by the way, because immunization campaigns did the same thing. Smallpox eradication did the same thing. So a lesson from this is that you don't need to fix everything to make a track of effective intervention. Now, I would say do that in 8 areas. I think education, it's a little more complicated, but it's similar. You could have educators that track that funding for education, SDG 4, actually gets to schools and students and devices for online learning and so on. So I would put a large emphasis on practicalities. That I don't like giving envelopes of money to anybody for good purposes or bad purposes. I like funding investment programs. And the investment programs have timelines, they have benchmarks, monitoring, and you can go in and look, was the school built? Is the teacher there? And so forth. And so very practical, down to earth stuff. If you frame the interventions in that way, I think we can get a lot of results, even in very weakly institutionalized environments. That would be my hypothesis. Interestingly, you know, I championed free bed net distribution. This was a 10-year fight. It was weird, so weird, because rich people kept saying, you can't give away things, you know, to poor people, they won't value it, although the rich people just beg to get things given away to them, whether it's tax breaks or other things all the time. But in any event, the bed nets actually reached poor people, and the malaria incidence came way down in Africa, at Africa scale, by a reduction of around 40% or so. So a very big effect. And there was a I thought hilarious, it was a serious academic study, but at the National Bureau of Economic Research, wondering how could it be that all of this wasn't stolen? Because the economist's presumption is that the principal agent problem would overwhelm everything, and there would be no way to get bed nets into huts. And so they did this long, elaborate study, and they ended up discovering the concept of pro-sociality, that it turned out the community health workers actually cared about getting the bed nets to the people in the community. This was a great revelation to my colleagues, by the way. Economists could not believe it. So they learned a new concept, and they found out that it was possible to do. So I'm a little less pessimistic, but it is not based on trust. It's based on a system. The system is, here is an implementable approach. You do it, and in 3 months, someone's going to come to monitor you and to audit this. And you're the district manager, and they're going to visit houses or huts, and they're going to see whether the bed nets are there. My view is that will work 80% of the time, which is phenomenal.
Thank you. I think we are doing a kind of research is there in anti-corruption as well, that if you have what Porter I was mentioning from Harvard, he did it about creation of social value by the corporates. It's basically alignment of interests. If your interests are aligned, then you don't need a big anti-corruption movement as such, because the people will be interested in so-called anti-corruption. People will be more aware. Thank you for bringing this, because this I always here at IACA, because we are developing this capacity building among people with a training or master's program. The whole purpose is to make people aware how to handle corruption. The people are not aware, basically. That is one very important point. Now we are coming to a close, so I would rather, I have more questions, but maybe if there are any question here, and I have some questions online, so
Great.
maybe we have the questions which are being.
Pavan.
Anybody here first in the room?
Pavan.
Someone here before I call on you.
Yes, please.
Pavan.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm Anna the chair of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. So we have a lot of things to, first of all, the role of civil society. Second, the nexus between corruption and all the rest, say, the criminal behaviors, the violence, all the different aspects that are included in the agenda. So for us, the question would be, what can we do from the civil society point of view to try to boost, to help in the implementation of the agenda?
It's obviously a great challenge, and a lot of effort is going into this question. I like the approaches of transparency, publication, process, enforcement of process on bidding, and mechanisms of community review. EITI, I think, is useful, although I would go farther in the kind of information that is being done. I think civil society also has a door to the IMF and to other agencies to say, you need to put systems in place that inform us and in which we can inform you. Even I put a lot of emphasis on the IMF in general, because in a government, the three ministers that matter the most are the finance minister, the defense minister, and the interior minister, often for bad reasons and sometimes for good reasons, but in general, the finance minister is key for resource allocation. The IMF meets the finance minister once a year, at least in the Article 4 consultations. Civil society could approach the IMF and say, when you have your missions, you need to have a day with civil society to hear our thoughts and so forth, to let us give inputs on key questions. This is just one example that comes to mind. But it's, also a lot of this is dangerous, and this is one of the huge issues, which is that when real big money is at stake, people use violence to enforce that. And then I'm really outside of my knowledge and comfort zone, but I think the transparency, the dialogue requirements, the process requirements are essential. You must have community engagement. You must publish the following. You must have engagement between government and civil society on a systematic basis, and using the international agencies which are present, the UN country teams, the IMF, and others, as a matter of dialogue is extremely important.
Our Dean Stelzer is, I think the technical issue is done. So I think he wants to make some statement. Please go ahead, and then Ambassador Yogi after that.
Hello, I'm calling in from Doha, from the conference of least
Thomas, you're on
developed
mute
countries.
still.
Now we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Sorry I couldn't greet you and introduce you. There was a technical issue. I'm calling from Doha, the conference of least developed countries, where the whole world is meeting to try to unlock the cycle of poverty for the 48 least developed countries. So many things that you have just introduced to us, and thank you very much for taking us right into the center of the challenges. with your extraordinary knowledge, expertise, and also empathy, which has sustained your lifelong struggle against poverty. It was very good following you. When you started and giving us the example of Congo, you have referred to tax evasion, tax avoidance, bribery, and corruption, to the 4 elements of the illicit financial flows. Yesterday, the Secretary-General here invited all of us to an emergency rescue of the SDGs. And I asked myself, we all say the same. We all know exactly how to improve the world, how to make it more livable. We know it. We have repeated it in the Doha program. We have it in the SDGs. Why don't we do it? Where is the hindrance? Where are the bottlenecks? And the biggest bottleneck, I think, is exactly what you refer to, the illicit financial flows, which siphon out trillions every year from productive economies and cannot be compensated for, neither by direct investments, nor by ODA, nor by remittances. This money is missing. And I would like to just come here with a productive, positive proposition. You know, the SDGs are aspirational, but fighting corruption is law-based. We have 2 conventions. We have the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention and the UN Convention Against Corruption, which has been ratified and introduced into, as incompletely as you have referred to, but introduced into national legislation. So fighting corruption is no luxury. It is law-based. We have to do it. And if we do it successfully, we will succeed limiting the illicit financial flows. And you have referred to military expenditures. And we have talked about the peace dividend for decades, limiting military expenditure and reinvest the money gained in sustainable development. We haven't invested a penny because, as you have also referred to, military expenditure has been growing every year. So we have to find a different, more pragmatic way to see where can we raise the money for SDG implementation. And here make a proposition. If we manage to limit illicit financial flows by fighting corruption successfully, then we have new means that decision makers can redirect towards SDG implementation. And then we can talk about something like an integrity dividend instead of the peace dividend. So why don't we make an integrity dividend the pragmatic goal of our efforts and unlock the bottlenecks of SDG implementation? So we raise the money, even in the post-COVID times, where all the coffers and budgets are empty, after we have parachuted trillions into stabilizing economies. If we can tap illicit financial flows by fighting corruption successfully on the basis of UNCAC, a global instrument that allows us to fight corruption on the basis of the rule of law efficiently, excluding impunity, if implemented, will succeed. And a last sentence in our own interest, it's exactly what the IACA is doing. Many countries in the last years have criminalized corruption. They have built rather resilient normative systems, but the lack is the implementation. There's a huge gap between normative systems and implementation. We have many examples where countries have perfect systems and still a lot of corruption. And this is where we are coming in. Offer technical assistance, capacity building for practitioners, that they learn that today we can fight corruption. We are no longer passengers of the arbitrary decisions of the powerful who misuse their authority for financial gains, but we have legal instruments to go ahead and fight it. So it's our responsibility, not an individual luxury, but a societal imperative, and to fight corruption because we no longer afford it. And the IACA is offering technical assistance, capacity building for practitioners, and 189 ratifiers of UNCAC, that they learn to understand the provisions of the convention better and learn how to implement them in their daily lives. It's a small step in the face of the huge problems that you have referred to before, but it is in a pragmatic way the value that we can add today and together. So thank you very much for leading us into the complexity of issues with all your empathy and all your activism, I have to say, because you were always not only an intellectual leader, but you were always a profoundly involved person. I have always admired this when we work together in the United Nations. So you are showing the way, and may I invite you to help us and work with us to identify the impact of corruption on each one of the 17 SDGs, that we can pinpoint and we can measure and we can hold those accountable who do not do what they're supposed to do, and that we can make real progress on the way of implementing the SDGs so that we can pass on a world to our children in which they can still live and enjoy their life. Thank you very much, Chef, for your contribution here. Thank you.
Thomas, thank you so much. Thanks for your kind words and your wise words, and for coming in from Doha from this important meeting. I think that there are some practical things that we could do, even in short order, that could be quite helpful. One is, where a lot of the corruption shows up is that multinational companies in low-income countries do not pay royalties or taxes on anything commensurate with their activity. And this is something where IACA, the IMF, the OECD, and others could actually document this. And it would not take a huge multi-year effort to measure how much of the value added is actually kept within the country and kept within the fiscal system, country by country. It's dismally low in several countries, like the DRC is an example of that. So that's one kind of issue. You know, where the corruption really hurts as a broad cross-cutting issue is simply the governments don't get revenues that they need for the public investments in healthcare, education, and other areas. A second major issue, of course, is our tax havens in the rich world, largely designed and promoted by a few countries. But why is it that in countless cases, when you look at a company that is civil society is criticizing, it turns out it's a Cayman Island company, a British Virgin Islands company, an American Virgin Islands company, because these are post office boxes to hide the beneficial owners. And of course, we've designed a system for tax evasion in the rich world and for responsibility and accountability evasion. So companies, in my view, that have Cayman Island headquarters should not be allowed to operate anywhere outside of the Cayman Islands, frankly. It's ridiculous. What are these companies? You can't even find them because they don't even have one employee. They have a board in which their board sits on 37 other boards. And it earns $1 per year on each board. In other words, it's a game. So the corporate game is really our construction. That's not poor people's construction, that's rich people's construction. That's a second area. Third, I wonder if we could investigate this business about the fines that are paid for illicit activities in the rich countries, like the Glencore fine. Why doesn't that automatically go into a fund that goes back to the beneficiaries of the countries in which these crimes were committed? So why isn't the $4 billion that the US collected, or whatever the courts imposed on Glencore, why isn't that to the benefit of the DRC or whatever in an institutionally appropriate manner? Maybe we could move on something like that, an anti-corruption restitution fund. And by the way, if there are many cases of multinational corruption where the injured government in the low-income country or civil society has tried to take these companies to court in London or in New York and are thrown out for lack of standing. And that also is a little bit of an abuse. You know, Shell polluted Nigeria for decades. When the Nigerian government tried to collect something in the London courts, they said, no, we have no standing. Shell is immune to this kind of lawsuit. So I think the idea of finding practical enforcement mechanisms would be something really interesting to work on as well. But your overall observations, you know, I completely 100% subscribe to and want to work together with you on that.
Thank you so much. I think we are running past time, but we still have some questions. Maybe short questions, short answers. Yugi, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm with Zekic. I'm old, you know, so there's a lot of biography, but I was for 30 years member staff of the UN. And then I was Serbian ambassador to the UN. Now I'm here on the European Public Law Organization, Vienna Investment. So what I wanted to say, I mean, I really, Professor Sachs, congratulate you what you presented. This is really astonishing because we have to change the paradigm of thinking and tools that you have been talking about. The number of tools that we have at our disposal today are not sufficient or efficient to reach some of the sustainable development goals and to fight also corruption. The examples of corruption that you have given is landing me to the concept that I developed 2-3 years ago, which is called organized corruption. And that is it. Multinational companies, these are interest groups. While our legal system, including my colleagues here from UNCAC are here, is all based on individuals. So we are still in the 2 centuries ago legal paradigm. Instead, the actors, both as offenders and victims, have changed. Less and less they are individuals, though there are, and more they are collectivities, right? Whether it's organized crime, criminal, or legal entities as multinational companies, sport clubs, political parties, name it. So this is what the comment that I wanted to make, and thank you very much.
I agree completely with you. And this question of tools is the key, because in the end, we have to do something practical, directed at the actual problem. But I agree completely with you. We're dealing with quite organized structures, of course. And these are structures of impunity often also. And not only in the places where that's attributed, but in the places of great power.
I have 2 questions, very short ones. One is from Myanmar, somebody from the anti-corruption agency, Myanmar.
Yeah.
He's writing that for implementation of SDG goals in practice, it is doable mainly by the developed countries, but how do we have the technical capacity development in less developed countries? This is one question, and another is from our student, which is quietly related one, that how do we have, generate SDGs experts as such so that they can implement activities in their programs?
Yeah, if we think about the SDG paradigm, I've tried to make it more manageable by thinking of a series of major categories of investment that at the core are the SDG agenda, including education, healthcare, energy transition, sustainable land use, and so forth. And in practice, these basic areas have ministries of government attached to them, but the ministries in general are not designed or equipped they're not designed, equipped, or financed for a transformative agenda. The normal life of a ministry is implement a national program based on the national budget. And here we're saying implement something much bolder than you're doing And we're not telling them where the budget's going to come from, by the way, but we're saying be much more ambitious. And in the end, it's very puzzling for these ministries. I tell them something which they find very strange, which is, okay, make an SDG-based plan. It's much bigger than your budget. Find out what your needs are. I'll go with you to the IMF or the US Treasury or others, and we'll say, look, this is the financing gap, now close it. Of course, it won't work that way so simply. And we don't have an international system that says, oh, they have a wonderful health, education, and energy plan, and it just requires an extra 2.3 billion a year, and of course, we'll provide that through the following instruments. We don't have that yet. So we're a little bit stuck. Even the planning seems naive to government officials that say, well, how are we ever going to pay for that? Are you kidding? We can't finance that. So finance is a major issue in poor countries. And we're a little bit stuck right now because there is no agreed answer to that. Where we are in practical terms is that there are sporadic statements, especially within the G20 process, that say we need to move from billions to trillions in sustainable development finance. We need to expand the flows of funding from the multilateral development banks. We need to have a new losses and damages fund. We need to protect the forests with new forestry funds and so forth. We're in the middle of that discussion, but as I said, actually right now, none of it even holds the agenda for 5 minutes compared to the geopolitics. So we're in a geopolitical crisis, which is very serious, and it crowds out serious thinking on all of these things. I believe we have to persevere to make this breakthrough in basically 3 things: how to plan for long-term transformation, how to finance long-term transformation, and how to implement long-term transformation. That's the governance of sustainable development: long-term planning, long-term finance, and long-term implementation. And I think we need new tools to do this. I don't think it's a waste of our time to work on that, because the problems are not going away, they're going to get more serious. There will be decarbonization of the energy system, because there has to be. What we don't know is the state of the planet by the time it takes place, whether we're in complete disaster or we finally made a breakthrough to avoid the worst. We don't know yet, but there will be this transformation. All children will be in school. I don't know whether that will be as of 2024, 2028, 2040, but you cannot have a society in which children are not in school as a successful society. It's impossible in this world. No country can afford to let a child not in school. The cost of that to society is unbelievable. 40, 50, 60 years of someone without skills, without a livelihood, without a means of support. It's devastating. Do that for half the population, you've lost any kind of decency possible at all. So we are going to do these things, and I think that the IACA agenda comes in absolutely at all 3 parts of this agenda. First, corrupt governments don't make long-term plans. They don't care. They have something else in mind. And by the way, my life experience, which is pretty good on this, I've met hundreds of finance ministers, and you can see in their eye in about 10 seconds that they're looking at you. Are you an idiot, Mr. Sachs? Do you think I care at all about what you're talking about? And you can watch that. Okay, that's one kind of government, or the other trying to figure out something. So first, setting goals depends on non-corrupt agents. Finance depends on the budget, on collecting revenues, and so forth. Third, implementation is exactly the process of going from paper or e-paper to on-the-ground implementation, which is the non-corruption agenda. So this is where we need the tools through this whole value chain and to train people. But the training is actually quite interesting because governments are not organized for any of these three things, actually. Their time horizon is different. Goal setting is very rare as a government process, amazingly rare, actually. Governments implement legislation as their main task. They administer, they do it rationally, irrationally, good or bad, but they don't set goals. Very, very rarely. So goal setting, long-term planning, long-term finance, long-term sustained implementation require a new kind of training and new kinds of institutions in government. And this is, I think, worth doing because it needs to be done. We can't find our way out of this. And one of the illusions that made all of this difficult is that people with wealth and power wave their hands about the private sector and the market will solve all of these things, and the invisible hand ideology. And it's a plaything, it's a game, it's ridiculous for the kinds of challenges we're talking about. It can't be done without active, quality, long-term governance. So that's, I think, where our agenda lies.
Thank you so much. We have many questions. One is related to climate finance and corruption, but I think we are running out of time. So I first thank you so much for being with us, and I love to be your student. But it was wonderful listening to you, and so much to talk on SDGs and corruption.
And we continue.
Yes, and I think we I must thank Dean for intervening, and then again, mentioning about our intention, how we can perhaps link SDGs with corruption. Wonderful. Each SDG, it's very tough and very huge task actually. 169 targets, each target may have some impact on corruption, anti-corruption. So maybe it is a long-term, maybe research, but this is an area we have to look into it.
Wonderful.
One is on the resources and other is in each SDG. So thank you for being with us, and thank you everyone. Time is running short, so I'm not taking any more questions. It was a pleasure.
Great. Thanks a lot.